I would still be. What is the Gothic? I will not have time to define it. There are people on this call who are members of the International Gothic Association, and there are probably at least a few people who are still not sure what Gothic might be. It's a genre of literature, a mode of thought, a worldview, and a way of looking at history. It's stories from the 18th century and from the 21st century. And we're going to hear about all different kinds of stories tonight. So I'm going to ask when they unspotlight me, and if there's a time when we're talking, when the people in the room are talking, that we do beg everyone who is participating via Zoom to stay muted. And we will hope for the best that this all works. In the New England Gothic isn't as well known as, say, the British historic Gothic of the 18th and 19th century, or even of Southern Gothic in America. But we have a 400-year-old history full of the secrets that people whisper and prefer not to bring to light. America's secrets of those of any colonizing power, the treatment of the people who were living here when the land was discovered, the oppression of the people brought here as slaves from Africa, the treatment of women, all of these things. New England has its share in these. My book, that's The Secrets of the Restless Dead of the subtitle, treats these, focusing on New England's history of decline and fall, the eugenics movement, xenophobia, and racist science. I'm wearing my Prime Evil t-shirt. There are also We Are Providence t-shirts to be found in the room. Stephen King, who was the lead author in this anthology, is among those who have made New England the horror capital of the world. But there are many other great writers of the New England Gothic, one of whom is on this call. Shout out to you, Joe Citro. So not all Gothic even involves the supernatural, nor does all horror writing in literature and film. You may find tales of monstrous humans, from murderers and rapists to abusive parents. And you'll hear from the participating writers of the anthology, We Are Providence, something about how those tales came about, right? I'm going to call on Christa Carmen, who is live in person at Otis, and also Lauren Elise Daniels, who's joining us on Zoom, who will tell you something about how the anthology We Are Providence came about. She'll introduce the authors who contributed short stories in person, and I'll introduce some of the ones on Zoom. And then after that, I'll tell you a little bit more about the Gothic literature and history of New England. And then hopefully we'll attempt to answer your questions. So please put them into the chat and hold them until after the presentation, regardless of how much you are tempted to interrupt, because I know there's so many experts who are on this call. So I'm going to turn it over to Christa in the room right now. Thank you. Take it away, Otis Library.
Okay, I'm going to keep my phone here just to be mindful of the time because we do have so many great presenters. Can everyone hear me on the call? Just give me one thumbs up. Yep, good. All right, my name is Christa Carmen. I am a Rhode Island-based horror writer. It's really nice to see everyone here in person. This will lead perfectly into how this anthology came about. I am very much a huge fan of Gothic literature and horror fiction in general. And gosh, I don't even know how long ago now, but I decided to start a chapter of the Horror Writers Association. So the Horror Writers Association is a big parent organization that has horror writers all across the world. And they support having local chapters. And there's so many wonderful writers in Rhode Island that write horror. And many of them, I think maybe most of them, I already knew. So I sort of was like, hey guys, do you want to start this chapter? And we have been having meetings for a couple months when I cannot take credit, Lauren cannot take, no one person can take credit for the idea of like, we're all writers who support one another and who love the same things, what better way to show that than to put together an anthology? So this is the anthology. It's called We Are Providence. As you heard Faye mention, there are a lot of definitions of what Gothic literature entails. And I think we definitely take the spirit of the Gothic into consideration in this book. There are stories that run, I'd say probably Faye's story and a couple others in particular really lean in heavily to the traditional Gothic narrative, but we have urban legend type tales and epistolary tales, and each story pulls in some way, shape, or form from New England, even if it's just the fact that the author has a huge history with Rhode Island and with New England, and all of their influences are present in the story. So what do I want to say? Yeah, just you're going to hear from each author what their influence for writing their particular story was. I will speak very briefly about my story. I was always very interested in Mercy Brown, the legend of Mercy Brown, who was a supposed vampire in Rhode Island. She was known as the last New England vampire. She was the last person in New England to be exhumed in the name of vampirism. So people thought that instead of tuberculosis being an illness, that people were rising from the grave and feeding on their loved ones. And so I'm sure there are plenty of things from what Faye said, the Gothic entails that you can see are involved in the Mercy Brown legend. And I kind of brought that legend into more modern times and did a tale about a young girl who was bullied relentlessly and sort of looked to Mercy Brown and the legend of Mercy Brown to get through that bullying and how that sort of works out for her. So again, I don't want to speak too long because I want my co-editor for this anthology, Lauren Elise Daniels, to speak a little bit as to how the anthology came about, and then we'll introduce the other authors.
Thank you, Christa. And thank you, Faye, for that wonderful introduction. You touched on so many glorious points and reasons why we're here. This anthology is evidence that not everything that came out of COVID was bad. We connected remotely. I approached Christa and the Rhode Island chapter of horror writers and said, what can we do? Can I be a part of your gang? I miss Rhode Island. I'm kind of quarantined here in Australia. And sure enough, collaboration landed this wonderful anthology. The voices here are outstanding and exciting. And it's just been a pleasure to be a part of this. Weird House Press as well. Thank you, Curtis, who's here today, Curtis Lawson. And Weird House Press took us under their wing and helped us make the book arrive in time for Necronomicon, where we launched in Providence. Every author brought a little taste of Rhode Island into their story, regardless of where the story was coming from or what time frame it was exploring. And that little Easter egg in each story has proved pretty satisfying to the readers so far who've remarked on the collection. As for co-editing with Christa, I think we shared a brain. It was one of those lucky matches where we just worked collaboratively so well together and passed the baton back and forth and just co-created something wonderful. Also just so appreciative of all the authors who were willing to work with us and contribute their voices. My little story, Spectacle Cove, is a kind of creation of a town. I guess it's kind of like Derry, Maine. For Stephen King, I wanted to make a little Rhode Island town that kind of feels a little bit like Wickford, a little bit like Warren. And the theme of my story is the destination of entitlement, of the colonizer mindset. And where does that take us if we just assume we can have whatever we want? And I landed with two sisters who need each other, but also tear each other apart as the story continues. I'm just delighted to be a part of this crowd, regardless of where I am calling in from. So thank you. And I might pass the baton back to Christa.
Sure. I'll just introduce each author in the room. And again, before we go any further, I want to give Faye a huge shout out, first and foremost, for sharing her book launch with us. She has a story in this anthology. Her first fiction publication, which when she told me that, I did not believe her because Faye is Faye and she is a wealth of knowledge. Actually, when I was researching a novel a couple years ago, I had a bunch of questions on some things that I couldn't find any sources for, and she had all of this information, and I went to tea at her house and I was like, where are like the reference books for this? And she was like, it's literally just in here. I'm the one that knows all of these things. So Faye is wonderful. She also wrote the introduction to this. So I wanted to give her a special shout out and then I'll introduce Joshua Rex, who is here with us in person today to talk a little bit about his story in the anthology. Come up and do you want to hold the flag?
Sure.
Do you want to have the book in your hand as a prop?
Hi, everybody. My name is Joshua Rex. I'm a Providence-based author of speculative fiction of all sorts. I also work for the Rhode Island Historical Society. So as far as Rhode Island horror, I deal with real horrors, real stories, things like slavery. Also horror stories like the Mercy Brown, where it's sort of more poignant. My story in this is called The Scariest Story, and I should premise by saying that about 20 years ago, I got a culinary degree from Johnson & Wales University, and so it's about 4 chef friends or restaurant employee friends who gather yearly in this campground, which is actually Alton Campground. So anyone familiar with Rhode Island will know that name. And they have this tradition where they tell scary stories to each other each year, and their friendships are sort of moving in different directions as their lives are getting kind of pulled apart, even though they work in the same place. And just, I guess, sort of a teaser to the story is one of the friends is not arriving, and we find out why later. Is that the same?
I think so.
All
I
right.
think so.
Yeah, and thanks to Faye and Curtis and Lauren and Christa, of course, everybody.
So Victoria Dolphy is also in the room with us here. So she'll talk about her story, passing the book along as a prop.
Keep carrying this book around in case you forget what book we're talking
I think we
about.
left it up there.
Perfect.
Yeah, so my name is Victoria Duffy. I am also a Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island based horror writer. My first book was like a straight up tribute to Gothic fiction. So I've always been very in it and do think it travels well into the contemporary. And so my story in this is called The Hidden Heart and is about a secret society club on Benefit Street in Providence, which if you're familiar with the city, and there's a lot of talk of like secret clubs and kind of that skull and bones kind of organizations in all of the old collegiate towns. And I liked the idea of kind of a weird, mysterious, potentially sex club that is operating there for the elite. So that is what my story is about.
We'll pass the book baton to Stephen E. Bellinger.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen E. Bellinger, and I've been a published author for about 10 years now. And this story really hit me in 2016 for obvious reasons. If you read the story, I think it'll be pretty clear. Stephen King said, write what you fear. So I fear technology controlling our lives. I always have. I'm very bad at technology. I'm a technophobe, to be honest. And so I don't like the idea of technology running amok. And I've kind of seen in the last 10 or 12 years a bit of a collapse of a society and how it starts small, kind of like Salem's Lot and Stephen King as well. How it can start from something like technology or politics or whatever, and it starts small, but then it kind of spreads to the population. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a short story, House of Usher, about the slow degradation of a house, a family, a home, and about how that decay can jump to others and spread. And I sort of saw that happen starting in 2016 because of technology, because of politics. My story shows how technology and politics can degrade a person, and then many persons, and then a society. And that's my story. Thanks very much.
Okay, so that's all of us here in the room. So we'll pass it back to Faye to introduce the other contributors to We Are Providence that are on the Zoom call.
Okay, this is where the technology gets difficult. But I think I'd like to start with Curtis Lawson, who, as Christa mentioned, is our contact with Weird House Press and a prolific Rhode Island writer. Are you with us, Curtis? You know that Zoom is very much like a seance.
I'm
Right
here.
now, yeah, okay. Right now, I'm only looking at myself, but hopefully you're about to be spotlighted. Curtis
Okay.
Lawson. That
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Curtis M. Lawson, and I am actually kind of new to the Rhode Island area. I have lived in Salem, Massachusetts for 7 years, and I moved right outside of Providence. And as we said, I do a lot of work with Weird House Press, so I was able to kind of broker this deal so that we could have the book come out in time for Necronomicon. And I was very, very happy to be able to do that because I'm proud of it as being part of the publishing side and being a contributor. And my story, as I said, I just moved to the Providence area. So I bought this house and I have all this land and this big garage, and like all this stuff was left here. The people who lived here before, they didn't clean everything out. So my story was kind of inspired by that, being in a new place and what kind of secrets that people might have left behind. And the folks that lived here before me, they bred Rottweilers, and like, so there was all this. I was like, oh, what am I gonna find if I like dig in the yard? What am I gonna find in the basement? They left like 4 refrigerators on the property. So I decided to write a story where this guy buys this house and he finds a witch jar in the wall, which is this old kind of New England folklore thing where you hide this jar with teeth and urine and hair and all sorts of nasty stuff. And it was supposed to absorb any witchcraft or negative magic, and it came your way and protect you from it. So I used that, and then I also, on a theme level, I wanted to explore just the idea of loss and coping with tragedy, just because everything I write is a downer. So yeah, that's my story.
Tell us the name of your story.
Oh, so thank you. Unsuccessful coping mechanisms for grieving lost lovers. Because I also don't like people to remember the names of anything I write.
thank you so much. Let's see, is Tiffany with us? As, or I should say, H.Y. Sue?
I'm here.
Yeah, okay. It's under H.Y. Sue, TSU, I think. Yay.
Okay, so my story is called A Possession, and what really inspired it was, I think, I was looking back. I like to look back at like things that I probably shouldn't look back on and reflect on, but I think it helps me like be a better person later on. What ultimately, made me think of this story was, I think, a lot of young girls, no matter how old, how mature they become later on, like always go through this phase where it's like, you think you want this, but you don't really want this. And, especially with romantic attachments. And it's just like, you might think this is healthy, but it's not healthy. And I was reminded of this recently when I saw a video pop up of that was detailing Woody Allen's relationship with Sun Yi. And I was thinking, well, a lot of times we have stories where it's like you wish for something and it's not what you wanted. It's not exactly what you wanted. It gets twisted and like, corrupted somehow. And my story is about, wishing for something and then realizing this, a romantic relationship especially, and realizing that this isn't what you asked for, but also I've also weaved into it the elements of, gaslighting, of, adult grooming, and, some sexism, because I feel like those are all still present in our society, and I wanted to bring attention to it. So yeah, that's my story.
Thank you. Thanks. See, I'm just gonna start my video again. Paul Magnon.
I'm here. Yep, this is Paul Magden, and I'm been in Pawtucket, Rhode Island all my life. My story is titled Soul Parasite, and it touches on mental illness and depression, and it touches on basic dissatisfaction of life that one can have that it can get to the point where the sands of reality underneath you shift in a way that you can just swallow one whole. And you know, in my story, a man finds a thing that brings him comfort, but everything around him suddenly becomes decayed and bad and evil. And basically, it's someone trying to find satisfaction in their life, but at a pretty much a terrible cost. So, and that's the gist of my story. You know, thank you for having me, and that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And let's see, Barry, are you on? Are you with us? Is anyone there? Barry Dejasu, Dejasu. If not, how about Ken? Christa, do you know if Ken Vaughn is signed on?
Yep, he's here.
Okay.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Am I coming through okay?
Yes.
All right, good. So hi, I am Ken. I write dark fiction as K.H. Vaughn. And I'm not actually sure I'm a horror writer. I think a lot of what I write is really about people living their lives within the context of horror, you know, rather than more of a traditional, you know, kind of effort to inspire terror. It's really, I don't know. There's a lot of loss and mourning and coping and dealing with life. And in that sense, I think that my story is kind of a bit of a working class New England Gothic piece. So the story is called Ghost Catch, and Ghost Catch is a term you find in commercial fishing, referring to all of the sea life that has been caught and trapped and will die in nets and traps that have been lost and abandoned out there in the ocean. And the story is about people in the fishing village of Port Judith, Rhode Island, which is a very real place. 100 years ago, it was a very small fishing village, and it grew to become one of the central fishing ports of New England. And it still is in some ways, but you know, the culture, kind of the local culture of it has in a lot of ways changed and become much more commercial as you know, as things do. So the story is about two people, a waitress in a local shoreline restaurant and a fisherman, who are both sort of kind of disconnected and detached and lost in their lives and their relationships, and they sort of drift. And they drift. And in terms of the inspiration of the story, a lot of my work comes from scraps of dialogue that will come to me, or an image, and then I have to decide who said that and why. What's the context? And in this case, it was this idea that some truly earth-shattering experiences occurred for someone, but they're the only witness, and there's another person present who says, "Did you see that?" referring to something else, you know. And so the story for me is really about Sonder, that sense that other people are having everybody's the own center of their experience, and everybody's experience is different, and about memory and the loss of history and tradition, and the ways in which, you know, stories decay over time. It's again, not a traditional horror story. I think it does. I ask a lot of readers, but I think the punch is there for those that will that are willing to kind of stick with the sort of floatiness of it until the end. So, and thanks for everyone for setting this up.
Thank you, Ken. Ken is also an editor himself and has certainly a wide view of the field. I'm going to ask the library to take us back to the room, to the library. And Christa, just looking for if you have any last words to wrap up. Hi, we going back to the room yet? Still seeing Ken.
If I speak, will it bring you back to
There we
me?
go. Okay,
Okay.
Christa, any last words on the book?
Last words, I mean, we were really thrilled that the anthology sold out at Necronomicon. That was a really great place to have. This was kind of our joint debut, was last weekend and this weekend for this book. So we clearly have hit a bit of a mark with Rhode Island horror Gothic readers. People seem to be really enjoying it, and where can you buy it is a great question. So we have a few copies available here. Because we sold out last weekend, we had to scramble to get a few more copies shipped here, so I'm glad that they arrived. And you can navigate to Weird House Press. If you just do a Google search of Weird House Press and We Are Providence, or even just Weird House Press, you can find their website. And it is also available on Amazon. So that's where you can find the book. And the other authors here that are in person, we have a couple of our individual titles for sale if anyone in the room is interested in taking a look at the books, and everyone on the Zoom call as well. I mean, we all have websites. I have cards for our group with me, and we all have websites that you can navigate to from that website. So yeah, that's all on my end.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of my fellow anthology members. This is really the most wonderful community to have joined after all these years. I did write the introduction. But that's really, I mean, Christa had asked me to write the introduction to the anthology. The story was a nice little bonus, I hope, to everyone. So this book, there it is, a little bit clearer. How it came about, it is also a product of the pandemic. During the early months of the pandemic, I was contacted by Carol Margaret Davison, a great scholar of the Gothic, who edits the International Gothic series for Anthem Press, an international scholarly press. And there are a number of people on this call who know Carol and are members of the International Gothic Association. So she invited me to give a proposal, which I was able to put together very quickly because I had written an earlier book on the New England Gothic, but that was 25 years ago, more. Lots has happened since then. Also, you may have noticed it's a very small book. It is a skinny book, which means that they can sell it for a little bit less than scholarly books usually go for, in the $80 to $100 and up. So you can buy one if you like. Again, from I believe for the people in the room, the library has a few copies, and it's also available from Anthem Press. So what is the New England Gothic? Well, I'm going to be talking about Norwich mainly. I mean, in my first book, I wrote quite seriously that anyone growing up here has to turn into a scholar or a fan of the Gothic, because one of the main themes of the Gothic is the decline from a previous high state, like the fall of the House of Usher that was mentioned, to a less high state. And in the traditional Gothic, including Poe, or with like the Masque of the Red Death or the Fall of the House of Usher, the long ago time is the Middle Ages, the time of castles and feudalism and so on. For us, the long ago time is the Puritans' occupation of this territory. And in Norwich, that meant that displacement of the native peoples, either voluntary or involuntary. We have both examples with the Mohegans and the Pequots. I happen to live, this house that you're looking at, this very kitchen is built over what had been the Mohegan Royal Burial Ground. So, I mean, it's clearly in the water. This is where I grew up. But in Norwich, I literally grew up hearing tales. Thank you, Richard Curland, Dick Curland, who ran a summer camp and told us stories and took us to meet Chief Harold Tantaquidgeon and medicine woman Gladys Tantaquidgeon of the Mohegans. And I got to hear their stories. I worked for the Norwich Bulletin, and that's where I discovered the New England native vampire belief, which Christa referred to. Norwich is such an emblem of the New England Gothic with all its secrets from slavery. But to be fair, we were also the home of the famous Black abolitionist David Ruggles. However, slavery was in force here right into the 19th century. And the story of Ellis Ruley, whose murder has never been solved. Secrets, that's what it's all about. Abandonment, abandoned farms, abandoned mills. Someone mentioned working class horror, blue collar horror, definitely a thing in New England, whereas once upon a time the Gothic genre was very much about the upper class, lords and dukes and so on. Today it is about the ordinary people, the people who have been left behind by history, perhaps, whether it's the fishermen in Rhode Island or the people of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or Central Falls, or whatever. So perhaps most famous for writing that kind of story is Stephen King, but we also have people like Joe Citro, another shout out. We have, and then there is the shadow of H.P. Lovecraft, whose influence is, in fact, gave us the title We Are Providence, because he several times said, I am Providence. And you can find that engraved on the marker that was placed on his grave by his fans. Among other things, the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, writer of the Yellow Wallpaper, whom I've presented about in the library before, lived right here in Norwich, spent the last part of her life here. We have to strike a balance between the scholarly and the popular. There are both on this call, scholars and fans of the Gothic and of horror. I tried to write a scholarly book that would still be interesting and readable by the non-specialist. And one last thread of the Gothic in New England is what's often called folk horror. Folk horror, most people these days know through film, from The Wicker Man to recently Midsommar, where the standard plot, the clueless city folk stumble on a country place, isolated, where old customs have survived or been revived. It's something usually involving a sacrifice. Are you recognizing perhaps the most famous story of New England Gothic, and the writer I haven't mentioned so far who's key to this? Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which some people point at as the ultimate folk horror story. These days, the film, somehow it always seems to involve a ram or a goat sacrifice, as well as the human sacrifice. All in all, when I talk about the Gothic at more length than I'm talking tonight, I'm usually telling people things they don't want to hear. Whether it was speaking in Beverly or Andover, Massachusetts, and telling them that the witch trials only took place in Salem, but that the witch hunt extended all through Essex County, and I was not invited back. Or speaking in Vermont and talking about the Vermont eugenics movement, which might have been a model for Hitler's Nuremberg laws. and I was not invited back. Really, it seems to be only Otis Library that's willing to have me keep telling them I don't want to know.
We'll see what happens tomorrow.
And I just thank you, Joe Citro, for a really great novel of folk horror called Lake Monsters, which combines the folklore of New England of lake monsters and sea serpents, something I mentioned briefly here in this book and more in the earlier book. And that's that in addition to Gothic history, Gothic literature, we really have all this wonderful Gothic folklore. So I think that actually gives us enough time to do some Q&A. And I hope there's some cues out there. Looking at the chat. Well, okay, monitoring the chat. Looking mostly, no, actually. Okay.
There's a question, Faye. Do you see it or do you need me to read it to you?
From Karen Wink.
Yes, yeah. Oh, you see it. Okay.
Karen Wink, friend of mine, asks, do you want to come back to the room? That would be okay. We can, just in case some of the people have questions in live.
Oh, okay. Well, that point you made about Vermont, the speaking engagement in Vermont, which you were not invited back to, sadly, regrettably, right? How did it relate to Hitler's Nuremberg trials?
Okay. The Nuremberg, what I meant was the Nuremberg laws, the laws that were enacted in 1933 and later, a set of laws that were the ultimate racial science laws that mandated sterilization and euthanasia of the unfit. And the unfit included both people who were mentally unfit, physically unfit, or racially unfit, which that became the final solution. In Vermont, the Vermont eugenics movement succeeded in passing laws that were actually also passed in Connecticut, though not as extensive. But in Vermont, in the late 20s, there were laws passed saying that that those who were racially or eugenically, which covered, again, all of those things I just mentioned, physical or mental defects, alcoholism, sexual misconduct, could be sterilized without their permission to prevent them from polluting the pool for the next generation. And that was what was known as the Vermont eugenics movement. And when Hitler was writing the Nuremberg laws, he looked at Vermont, he looked at several southern United States that had similar laws, that had the laws forbidding interracial marriage, for instance, and said, well, if they can do it, we can do it.
Oh my goodness, I never heard that before. That's very disturbing. Yeah, but you were just telling the truth and they didn't invite you back.
Right, they did not. It was truth that they did not want to hear. Okay, I see Claire Kavanaugh with a question. Let me see. In your book, you spoke about the early colonial view that while Europe might be God's, North America belonged to the devil and needed to be claimed for God. I guess this is an aspect of the colonial entitlement you've mentioned, but I'd love to hear more about it. Maybe a silly question, but why bother claiming North America? Okay. Well, for one thing, there were many different colonizing powers that were interested in North America. We know that the Spanish colonial view, then the Catholic view, was that those souls that belonged to the devil could be reclaimed for God, that what they were doing was a great Christianizing movement, that 1492 is not coincidentally the end of the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula, so that, and the beginning of the Inquisition becoming so strong there, of trying to reclaim all the souls on the peninsula that were not expelled, like the Jews and the Muslims, anyone reclaiming them for God. So you crusade, you send people over here, conquistadores. Well, for the Puritans, there was not such a belief that these were souls that could be saved. There were some groups who did believe that, and that's why Rhode Island came about. Roger Williams believed that the souls of the native people could be saved and should be saved, and that they were human beings with a language. One of his works was to attempt to write down the languages of the Wampanoags and other people in Rhode Island, the Narragansetts in Rhode Island. But if you read Cotton Mather and the first generation of Puritan divines, they're pretty sure that these were the people of the devil who were devil worshippers, and that they had to be exterminated or moved. And one of the horrors that may have given us this whole trope of the haunted, the cursed Indian burial ground, is that when they arrived, they found that many of the native peoples had already died, and they saw these plagues, which had been brought by earlier European visitors, as God's judgment on this people. They had cleared the land before them. So that's what I have spoken about. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, descendant of Puritans, covers this pretty well in Young Goodman Brown and in The Scarlet Letter. It makes it clear that the forests, the wilderness belonged to the devil. And so they were frightening. They were frightened. They didn't know whether they feared the supernatural or the natural more in the wilderness. Does that answer your question? I mean, it's just a start to answer the question, I realize. But one of the things I do talk about in the book, and that others might read about further, is eco-criticism. That the eco-Gothic criticism these days talks about the ecophobia of the Puritans that led to the clearing of forests as well as the clearing of the people in the forest in the name of reclaiming the wilderness for God, really. Okay, are there questions in the room or questions of the people in the room?
Claire?
Can they hear me? Or can you hear me?
Yep.
I can, although if you want to put it back to the room, that's okay.
How much of the mindset of these folk tales and mentality either translates to or comes from the children's nursery rhymes and old stories that also have a very dark tinge to them?
For example, I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding the question.
European folk tales of kids going into the forest and
of course. Of course.
All of that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The start of ecophobia was definitely the idea that the devil is literally in the woods. There's the dark woods of German folk tales and Northern European folk tales are always, you're right, that is exactly where you get into trouble. Where you and there's no doubt there are witches there. The witches' Sabbaths are there. In fact, even in New England, after there was no longer a threat from the Indians, there was still a belief that witches met out in the woods. Devil's Hop Yard State Park, for example. It's called Devil's Hop Yard because there was this tale that that's where the devil brewed his hops in those kettle holes. And that witches would gather around and have their Sabbaths there. And that was, from still being told as late as the 19th century. So, yeah, thanks, Claire. There are people on this call who are experts in the connection between the European Gothic and the European folktale. Did I see another question popping up?
Chase had a question.
Oh, Charlie Chase, do you want to say it or? Charlie Chase says, could you say a little about the Native American vampires? Okay, native is probably the wrong word because it's very much a European belief. It's something not found among the natives, the people who were here before. But Christa, maybe can I throw this one to you? Can we let Christa answer that one?
So, well, Faye, why don't you start it? You start it off and I'll take it over, because I think
Okay.
we're talking about like the Hessian soldiers and that piece of it.
Yeah. There's a theory. Michael Bell, who is the person, both Christa and I managed to refer to him in one way or another, in his all his life, it seems, has been compiling the cases of the American tuberculosis connected vampire belief. But why it came about is debatable. His theory is that it was brought here by Hessian mercenaries who served here first in the French and Indian War, and then, of course, in the Revolutionary War, because their part of Germany is very close to the Eastern European part and Austria, where there were major vampire like what we call real vampires, blood-sucking, risen from the dead vampires in the 18th century. My theory is that it started here and that it was a response to, as one way of just trying desperately to explain how tuberculosis could run rampant through a family and yet not affect other people in the community. And we know it's because of germs, in the same way that COVID can be transmitted through a family and maybe not affect others that are not exposed. But the germ theory was later on. In the 19th century, there were many explanations for the consumption epidemic. Listen to the word, consumption. It seemed as though the people who had tuberculosis were being consumed by something that stole their breath and their life force. And the term vampire was something that was tagged onto it later. Oh, yes, we have a Jewett City person, Stephanie Sear. And yes, Jewett City, Griswold, was the site of several such exhumations. And a famous excavation in 1990 where an abandoned cemetery was found that seems to support, with physical evidence, this belief that the dead were exhumed after and blamed for the spreading of the epidemic. Christa, do you want to pick up then?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know whose theory, I like Michael Bell's theory. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I too kind of like the idea and think that there's a lot of weight to the idea that it could have started here. Something that Michael Bell talks a lot about in his book, and that I found just trying to do my own research for a novel having to do with Mercy Brown when I went to the historical societies around Exeter and surrounding areas. The records, I mean, this is so very much, they talked about secrets in Norwich. It was just such a thing that it just seemed like such a New England tradition where it's very hard to follow a through line as to where or why or when the exhumations that we know about occurred. And it just seemed like something that, you know, like kids play telephone or like gossip spreads today. It's like, if you look at the instances of exhumations that Michael Bell tracks in his books, it's like one particular one that I found was that somebody that was around a few years before the Mercy Brown exhumation was also, and it's been a few years since I've like looked at the research, but this person that had moved to the area was the relative by marriage of somebody that was exhumed years earlier. So it's like, it was very much something that spread through verbal records and like very vague actual records. So like you weren't going to find, well, eventually you had newspaper articles about Mercy Brown being exhumed, but prior to that, in the 1700s and the earlier 1800s, it was maybe finding a very informal record of like a request to dig up a loved one for some unknown reason was, was trickling through the powers that be, and that information lived to see the light of day today. But yeah, it's such an interesting, very New England concept. And I'm very much looking forward to Michael Bell is supposed to be publishing a new book about a huge amount. So I think when the Food for the Dead, which is his first book, was published, there were 86 exhumations that he had discovered. And the new book is supposed to go into like a whole wealth of new discoveries. And I think there's supposed to be some possible exhumations in Westerly, which I'm interested in because that's where I'm from. So I'm like, where am I going to go check out cemeteries to see these graves? And yeah, if you aren't aware, you can visit the graveyard in Exeter that Mercy Brown was exhumed in, and there's a couple other places of exhumation that have very, very clear records because they were passed down through familial verbal records.
The cops
Yes.
do not like to go at nighttime, though, I will say that. Someone who has been chased out of there by the police, don't go in the night.
Yes, that's a very important thing to remember because that site has been vandalized over and over again, and they don't want to have that happen again. And thinking about Stephanie Sears' question, the other exhumation that was well documented was the Ray family of Jewett City, and that family was written about in the Ancestor of the Norwich Bulletin, in the Norwich Courier. And that was the first trace that I found of it. So that when in 1990, a cemetery was dug up by mistake, just about a mile away from where that had happened, Nick Bellantoni, the state archaeologist, was brought in, and this has been written about. There have been scientific articles published about it, and research is still going on, DNA tracing of that incident. But this is all you can see the movement back and forth that Christa talks about. What is interesting is that until the 1990s, this was really not known, or if it was known, it was really not believed. I interviewed Stephen King for my first book, and I said to him, hey, why did you bring European vampires to Maine for Salem's Lot? Why didn't you make them New England consumption vampires? And he said, what? He had never heard of them. So it's it's a story. Now, Joe Citro knew about it because there are a number of ones that were preserved in Vermont folklore and history, but it really hasn't. Lovecraft mentions the Exeter superstition in the Shunned House, his story, the Shunned House, but they're really we can say that our book, is one of the few contributions in fiction to the New England vampire belief, and the other is Caitlin Kiernan's The Red Tree and a couple of her short stories. But the bibliography is not large. We all have to hope that Christa's novel gets published because it will be the first full-length work just about that the story.
So Faye, I hate to burst everyone's bubble here. I know there's more questions, but we are coming up on 7 o'clock here. So I don't know if you had some final words that you'd like to say before we end the evening. We'll definitely have Faye back in this wonderful panel. We have to do this again because I know there's a lot more questions that need to be answered, and this has just been a wonderful evening. I thank you so much, Faye, for putting this together. I knew this took a lot of work and a lot of effort, and we here at Otis Library so appreciate it. And we love having you back. We will have you back anytime. And Dr. Bellantoni, I remember when Dr. Bellantoni was here and he credited you for some of the help that you gave on his research. Remember, right here in this community room.
Yes, right. When we had the wonderful Smithsonian exhibit, the Human Origins exhibit, remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to, I'm going to repeat the chat lines that are coming in fast and furious. Thank you to all of the Rhode Island authors for participating, for being here in person and on Zoom. Thank you, Otis, for sponsoring, and thank you everyone from around the world for being part of this. And I hope that that you will continue this exploration, and we'll talk again. So I hope. So I'm going to say good night to all of the Zoomers. Good night, our time. Good morning, Australia. Good middle of the night. Good middle of the night to Russia, I believe. And hope that we can all do this again. Thank you, Anastasia. So, thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Paul, Ken, all the authors that came on Zoom. Thank you, guys.